You're listening to The Map of Us, a companion podcast to the LGBTQ Media Mapping Project. I'm your host, Dana Piccoli, Managing Director of News Is Out, a pioneering queer media collaborative. Welcome. This episode looks at fear and fortitude in queer journalism. The Mapping Project documented how many LGBTQ reporters and publishers are working under real threat, from harassment and doxing to hesitant sources, cyberattacks, and political pressure on their coverage. Some outlets have even scrubbed staff information from their sites to protect their teams. These stories came up in our focus groups and surveys, showing how the climate is reshaping daily newsroom decisions. To talk about what this looks like in practice, we're bringing together two voices from the Bay Area Reporter. Reporter Matthew Bajko and news editor Cynthia Baird shared a one-on-one conversation about the pressures they've navigated, the professional safeguards they rely on, and keeping sources and reporters safe during troubling times.
Hi, my name is Matthew Bajko, and I'm an assistant news editor and political reporter for the Bay Area Reporter in San Francisco. And I'm talking today with my news editor, Cynthia Baird, about fear and violence in news gathering that different LGBTQ publications like ours have faced over the last several years. This conversation today was inspired by the Media Mapping Project. And Cynthia, why don't you explain a little bit of what that is?
So the Media Mapping Project was done with support of the MacArthur Foundation, and it looked at a variety of LGBTQ publications across the country. And it was released in the fall. Our paper and several other publications did do articles on it to kind of amplify the findings, which showed that there are LGBTQ news deserts in much of the country, and the number of LGBTQ publications has decreased over the years due to various reasons, some of which are financial and kind of a lack of advertising and reader support.
Being based here in the Bay Area, we certainly are not in a news desert. And it seems like the news has only gotten more plethora of LGBTQ related stories at all levels. And as we said, this conversation is about some of the obstacles that our reporters and other reporters we know at LGBTQ publications have been, encountering in covering these stories. What would you say has been one of the main issues that you're hearing from your staff writers in recent years?
So most of the issues that we receive at the Bay Area Reporter concern people who don't want to be fully identified, that is, using their first and last names in an article. We've seen this especially in the trans community, and we've noticed it become more pronounced since President Donald Trump returned to the White House in January. As most people know, he quickly issued several anti-trans executive orders right away when he took office, affecting U.S. passports, gender-affirming care, and trans people serving in the military. And there are lawsuits against all of those things and more across the country right now. The paper's general practice is not to remove content from our website. I would say we get maybe half a dozen requests every year from people asking that their names, sexual orientation, or gender identity be removed. We generally do not do this, but circumstances can change, and we consider each case individually on its merits. If we do make a change like that to an article, we generally put a little updated note at the end of the original article explaining the situation and what we did.
I think we have an example relating to my coverage from last year when I had met this queer artist here in the city who also is into saving and rescuing rabbits and bunnies. And she does plush animals. And I thought, oh, this is a really great pride story. And I also, with my notebook at the end of the year, I've been asking local queer trans artists to do op art as a special kind of way to bring out the year. And we had engaged her to actually do a plush rabbit with LGBTQ themes that we could, highlight in the op art feature for 2024, which she agreed to do. And I, wrote this big profile and spoke to the woman who runs the bunny rescue that she helps, raise funds for through the sale of these plush bunnies. And we ran the story and, she loved it. The bunny people loved it. But then we received a email from the mother of her, and can you explain what we ended up doing after hearing from her?
In the original story, the woman had mentioned the gender identity of the relative, and Matthew was contacted by the relative to ask that that reference be removed. Even though we did not name the relative, the parent was concerned about identifying information being published, and so, we did kind of remove that reference from the story.
And why did you feel that was okay to do in that instance?
Well, we didn't actually ever speak to the relative in persons, and the relative in question was a minor, so those were the 2, factors that I considered.
And I have to say that I've worked for the paper now since 2001. And the reaction that we get when we interview people has certainly changed over the decades because from the get-go, you had told me the paper's policy was to ask people how they identify under the LGBTQ umbrella. And back in the 2000s, people were so unused to being asked about that they kind of would flinch. They would question why we needed that, and really it was because we wanted to ensure our readers didn't assume, like if we were interviewing a straight ally, that they were gay or lesbian or bi or trans, but also that people understood we were talking to more than just gay men. And we are the LGBTQ newspaper of record for the Bay Area and San Francisco. And so when you would have that conversation and explain to people, they would get it. There'd be some hesitancy. I think when our city helped, turbocharge the conversations and laws around marriage equality, that kind of went away. Since the 2010s, it was more straight people who would have that reaction of like, "I've never been asked that before." And our LGBTQ sources, like, had just gotten used to it, and maybe that also had something to do with the rise of social media and the internet, and where, people were more used to now putting it in their profiles, putting it on, dating apps and all this stuff, so it wasn't unusual to be asked that, but I have to say, since probably the election of Joe Biden and through the election of Donald Trump, we've been getting more pushback on if people want to be identified, if they want to have their full names used. And particularly when it comes to trans and queer youth, we definitely have to be more careful. And I've found myself just double checking with parents. Are you sure it's okay that we disclose that? Because in that like that other story, I did not interview their child, because it didn't really, make sense for whatever the topic was. We were just kind of mentioning their children, and some have said, "Oh, actually, no, I don't want them in the story." Where in the past, they wouldn't have even thought twice about it. You also had an issue regarding a story from our online archive come up. Can you explain what
Yeah,
happened in that instance?
yeah, in April, I received a request from a cis mom asking me to remove her trans child's name that appeared in an article back in 2019, even though she gave that information to a reporter in an on-the-record interview at that time. Since then, her child had apparently begun to experience negative reactions from fellow students at school. That was kind of a consideration that I took into account, and I did remove the child's name, but explained that after so many years of the article being online, it would likely still show up in caches on the internet, and in fact, that is the case. But when you click on the link, the child's name is not there anymore.
Yeah, I don't know if people really understand that about the internet, and that somehow think they think if we just remove something from one line in an article, it won't be found again, but that's really not how the internet works. It's on there forever and ways that people just can't really remove it from.
Yeah. And the other thing I've noticed with a lot of these requests that I get is when you go and Google them online, our article is the first thing that comes up generally, and that is likely because they haven't really done anything else uh, that would generate any kind of news for them, and that's
Mm.
kind of the focus of several emails that I get when in these requests is that, it's the first thing that shows up and but like you said, online is forever. So,
And what about an instance where you got a request like this and felt it was not appropriate to remove the person's or individual's name?
so that happened earlier this year. A trans woman asked that her name be removed from a 2024 article about her filing a lawsuit against a nonprofit that she used to work for. And she told me in the email that she was no longer publicly identifying as trans. But in this case, I did not remove her name, mainly because the lawsuit is public record. But also, in this case, the woman and her attorneys had originally contacted us to pitch the story.
And why did that factor in?
Mostly because of the public nature of the lawsuit. When
Mm.
you file a lawsuit in court, it is public. It's in online court searches of the various courts, or if it's a federal lawsuit, it's available on a website called Pacer that tracks federal lawsuits, and it's there.
So I've worked at the paper long enough that I actually have seen our rules and guidebook on using people's names in lawsuits and even trans individuals change over the years. In terms of law, there was a whole debate around dead naming of sources, which sadly, still goes on in certain publications or around certain stories. Can you just explain what the paper's policy is on using people's names, just in general?
Yeah, our policy is to use the names that they give us, and how they identify. We respect their choice of pronouns. We do not dead name people, and this can become an issue, particularly if a trans person is killed, and the family continues to use the dead name and wrong pronouns, and we do not do that. There have been cases when that's happened in a direct quote in an article, and we will indicate that that person is using the pronoun with which the person did not identify. For crime stories, we generally do not use a victim's name unless they really want to be public about it, and we've had cases where that's been the case. Uh, for other stories and features, like Matthew was talking about earlier, there's been kind of this growing concern about LGBTQ people who don't want to be publicly identified, and so we respect that, um, unless it's kind of a public issue, or a public meeting or something like that. For minors, it's our policy to get permission from a parent or guardian. We
What's the age cap there?
16.
Okay.
And Matthew has done that for stories he's written recently on LGBTQ youth, and we've had both instances where a parent is and the kid are fine with it, and those who are not. Um,
I've also had conversations around um, features, or whether it's a more news feature or kind of more of an artsy feature on how we're going to handle gender identity disclosure, especially around youth, because their concepts of how they're identifying are still kind of like being somewhat fluid. And so, I had an instance where I was set to profile a minor and they really wanted to talk and they actually had no problem having their full name used. The parents felt we shouldn't use their last name. And then I pointed out to them, I'm like, well, it's very easy. Once again, it's the internet. Anything can be found if you look hard enough or stumble upon it. But in this instance, the youth's full name was on a website that was linked to the stories. So I'm like, it kind of, people will, if they go on to that page, they will see your full name. And so then they thought more about it, and um, they were okay with us using the full name, but they wanted us to be very careful on how we talked about, their gender identity and sexual orientation because they still were questioning that themselves. And so that's kind of how I said, well, we can say that you're questioning it, or, we don't I always tell people, and this has also been the longtime policy of the paper, we don't out people, and unless in very, very rare circumstances where we decide it makes sense for what the story. But for the most part, I leave it up to the people to come out and however they want, and it also is like what terms we allow people to use is very wide. We're not very restrictive on that. So but I've definitely had more of those conversations in the last 2 years, tying back to people's concern that once the story goes live on our website, that they could be doxxed, or they could be harassed, or they can, be attacked in the in comments on, people sharing the story. We don't really have comments on our website, but it could, get picked up by another news outlet that posts the story, and they might have the ability for people to make comments there. So it's been another consideration in trying to get people to talk about important issues in a time when they're already being silenced and their voices are more important to be heard than ever. And it's another hurdle that you face in making sure that we are telling people's stories accurately and
Mhm.
fairly, right?
Yeah.
And so in terms of, threats to our own staff or website, what have we experienced, or what have you heard other maybe LGBTQ newspapers have to deal with over the last 2 years or so?
Well, we have been very fortunate in that we have not had any personal or phone threats made to staff. In terms of website threats, I know some LGBTQ publications did experience something like that earlier this year. It was kind of a phishing scam. And some LGBTQ nonprofits also experienced that. We have had some denial of service attacks on our website, but we don't really know who was behind them. And that is,
And when that happens, what's the impact?
well, our website will go down or become very slow. Our IT team generally kind of keeps track of our traffic on our servers and will alert our publisher and our in-house IT person if there's unusual traffic happening. We also get a report. We use Malware Bytes for our internet or website security, and we get a report every month that lets us know if there's been any unusual incoming traffic. Uh, our publisher provided the report for November, and we had 0 threat detections for that month. Um, Over the years, the paper has received harassing phone calls, but this is generally like very, very long time ago. Our publisher related a story that about the time some guy would call and stay on the line for a long time trying to fill up the paper's voicemail box. But like I said, that was decades ago, and we haven't really experienced anything like that recently.
Well, and I guess to wrap up our conversation today, what is your, as the news editor for the paper, what is your biggest concern as you look into 2026 on the safety of your staff, and particularly we use a lot of freelancers who go out, into the community to cover stories on their own. Any issues that you talk to them about?
Most of our freelancers have been with us for a long time, and so I know them pretty well, and I'm sure that they would let me know right away if they experienced any kind of harassment or threat, and I would never send a reporter or a photographer into a situation that could be dangerous. I guess looking forward to 2026, and mostly because of the federal efforts that the Trump administration is pursuing, as is Republican members of Congress. I'm concerned that more and more people won't want to talk to us on the record and share their stories. And like Matthew was saying, these are important issues that we cover. I mean, just this week, another healthcare provider in the Bay Area paused gender affirming care, and I had a freelancer go to a rally on that on Monday. Certainly respect people's need to feel safe and not undergo, online attacks or doxing and things like that. But that is probably a big concern of mine going forward, that we'll just see more of people uh, not really wanting to talk to us uh, fully identified about issues that they're experiencing or that their families are affected by, or things like that.
Well, hopefully, those instances will be minimal and that people will feel that in talking particularly to an LGBTQ news publication that we approach our stories with a little more sensitivity around these issues and that they might be able to trust us to accurately tell their story and feel comfortable um, sharing it with us and with our readers. Because it would be a shame for our community to have to go back into the closet, even even in the news pages of an LGBTQ newspaper. Well, this has been Matthew Bajko, assistant news editor and political reporter for the Bay Area Reporter, in conversation with my news editor, Cynthia Laird. And this conversation was inspired by the Media Mapping Project.
Before we wrap, we want to thank our partners supporting this work. The LGBTQ Media Mapping Project is funded by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, with support from the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at City University of New York, Local Media Association, and News is Out. To learn more about the Media Mapping Project, visit newsisout.com. Special thanks to Ken Schneck of the Buckeye Flame for the use of his podcast platform, and to Matthew Bajko and Cynthia Laird of Bay Area Reporter for their thoughtful conversation today. And thank you for listening. Your attention makes space for the journalists doing this work every day. We'll see you on the next episode of The Map of Us.